Welcome back to Mrs. Kate's YouTube channel. As we've said, in this chapter, we're focusing on transboundary pollution in Europe. Throughout this chapter, we'll be looking at 3 examples of how pollution spreads from one place to another. In Section 3, we're looking at the Chernobyl radiation accident. In Section 4, we'll study acid rain and the Black Triangle. And in Section 5, we'll take a look at the Tisza-Danube cyanide spill. Today, we're focusing on Section 3, the Chernobyl radiation accident. Your learning objectives for this lecture are as follows. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to explain how the Chernobyl radiation accident happened, describe how people were affected by the accident, and discuss how accidents like this can be prevented in the future. As you watch, please fill in your guided notes on pages 20 and 21 in your workbook. Remember, just like last time, I'm not going to give you all the answers underlined in red. Throughout the lecture, you'll have to pay attention and listen for the answers. Also, you will receive a homework quiz during the next class to check how well you understood this material, so please pay attention. In this lecture, we're going to travel back in time to April 25, 1986. We're going to visit the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. So what is Chernobyl? As you learned in a previous lecture on nuclear energy, a power plant is a place that creates electricity. All of our electricity comes from power plants. Chernobyl was a nuclear power plant. This means that the electricity that it produced came from nuclear energy. Here you can see a picture of what nuclear power plants look like today. But back in the 1980s, Chernobyl looked like this. So these power plants produce electricity by controlling nuclear energy. As you know, nuclear energy can be great since it's cheap and clean. But as you also know, nuclear energy can sometimes be dangerous. In this lecture, we're going to see one example of how it was very dangerous. Chernobyl lies near the city of Kiev in Ukraine. At this time, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine later became independent after the Soviet Union broke up into 15 separate countries. Chernobyl was one of the hundreds of nuclear power plants operating in about 30 different countries. On the map in your workbook, please draw the Chernobyl power plant just like you see it on the map here. If you need time to draw, you can pause this lecture. As we've discussed, nuclear power plants use uranium for fuel. Remember, this was the red molecule that we saw breaking apart during nuclear fission. The uranium is mined from the ground, like coal or copper. Then it's put into a special container called a nuclear reactor. Inside the reactor, it can be controlled, and uranium gives off energy in the form of heat. In our last lecture, we talked about how nuclear reactors are normally controlled, but that sometimes they can become uncontrolled. This can create an explosion like a nuclear bomb. Remember, nuclear reactors need to be kept at a safe temperature. If a reactor gets too hot, it can explode. This is what happened at Chernobyl. So what exactly happened? At 1:24 a.m., very early in the morning, an explosion shook the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. This happened because one of the reactors got too hot. A huge fireball rose 3 miles into the air. In this picture, you can see the destruction from that accident. Notice how in the center, it looks like the entire building has been destroyed. This accident did not just happen. It could have been prevented. Like in your own science lab, there are certain rules that you have to follow. You have to wear protective goggles and gloves and things like that. These are rules that you follow to keep you safe. But on the night of the accident, the workers at Chernobyl did not follow their own safety rules. As a result, one of the reactors got too hot, and this is what caused the Chernobyl power plant to explode. The explosion started a fire that quickly came out of control. In this picture, you can see how the Chernobyl buildings were totally destroyed. This was all caused by the fire and the explosion. But the biggest problem was not the fire. It was the huge cloud that formed over Chernobyl after the explosion. This cloud was made up of deadly radioactive dust. Remember in our last lecture we talked about radiation? We said that if a reactor explodes, it will send nuclear radiation into the air, just like we've seen. We also said that this radiation has no taste or smell. You can't feel it. You don't necessarily know that it's there. But if it's in the air, people will breathe it in. It will go onto their skin and into their bodies. It will also go into the soil and ruin the crops that people eat. If people were to eat these crops, they would become toxic and poisonous. We also explained that when people are exposed to nuclear radiation, they can develop cancer. Cancer can be a deadly disease, especially if it's not treated. On the map in your workbook, label the cloud to show that it contained radioactive dust. You can even label it deadly if you want to. If you need time, please pause this video. As you can see on the map, the radioactive cloud spread to several places thousands of miles away. Even though the accident happened at a single power plant, it became a problem for people in nearby countries. This is because the radioactive cloud did not stay over Chernobyl for long. These next images show how the radiation, the pollution, spread throughout Europe. This picture shows you how far things had spread in day 1. Just one day, and they've spread pretty far already. Now this is after 1 week. Notice how it covers several countries in Europe? Winds carried the radiation north towards Sweden and then south towards Central Europe. And here you can see what happened after 2 weeks. The radiation had spread even further. Radiation moved south and east, going down into Africa and across Asia. It's very likely that even Saudi Arabia was affected. It eventually crossed the Atlantic Ocean and reached the United States and Mexico as well. In class, we've talked about different types of pollution. In particular, we described pollution that spreads from one country to another. The Chernobyl radiation accident is clearly an example of transboundary pollution. It's crossing from one place, one country, to another. Countries close to the disaster suffered the most. The country most affected by Chernobyl was Belarus. As you can see on this map, Belarus borders Ukraine to the northwest. About 70% of the radioactive dust from Chernobyl fell on Belarus. And there were 2 major problems with this. First, one problem was that radioactive dust went into the soil. The people of Belarus are farmers, so this meant that when their crops grew, they would be full of toxic chemicals. None of this food could be eaten. Second, an even bigger problem for the people of Belarus was that the radioactive dust went into their air and into their drinking water. We've talked about how a deadly disease that can develop when people are exposed to nuclear radiation. Can you remember what it's called? Yep, you guessed it. Over the next several years, the people of Belarus had much higher rates of cancer than normal. In your workbook, take a moment to list the 2 ways that the people of Belarus were affected by the Chernobyl accident. If you need time to write, you can pause this video. The people of Belarus were not the only ones who suffered. The people of Lapland also suffered. You can see Lapland here on the map. Lapland is an area in the far north of Europe and includes parts of Sweden and Finland. Many people here fish for a living. Others raise herds of reindeer. After the Chernobyl accident, radiation polluted their fishing grounds and their reindeer herds. Many animals died. Those that survived were not safe to eat. In your workbook, list one way that the people of Lapland were affected by the Chernobyl accident. You can pause this video if you'd like. So what did the Soviet government have to say about all this? You would think that if a huge explosion happened in your country, that people would hear about it, right? But remember, in the beginning, the Soviet government kept the accident a secret. They were embarrassed. I mean, think about it. Your workers were careless and didn't follow their own safety rules, and now, as a result, you're giving people in other countries cancer, and you've ruined all their crops. So instead of telling the whole world and trying to protect people, the Soviet government covered it up. They denied that there had been an accident in the first place. But as we read in the introduction of our chapter, Swedish scientists figured it out. They raised alarms about rising radiation levels. Finally, an announcement was made on Soviet television. An accident has taken place at the Chernobyl power station, and one of the reactors was damaged. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences of the accident. Those affected by it are being given assistance. That's it. That's all they said. In the days and weeks that followed the accident, the Soviet government did do a few things to control the situation. First, they sent a large group of engineers into the city of Chernobyl. Over the next few weeks, they built a huge concrete box around the damaged reactor. This big concrete box was supposed to protect everybody from the radiation that was still inside. Almost 30 years later, this big box is still actually there. I would say that you should go see it, but then you might be exposed to deadly nuclear radiation, so it's probably not a good idea. The big concrete box is going to have to remain in place until the reactor is no longer dangerously radioactive, and that's probably not going to be for hundreds of years. The Soviet government also did something else. They moved people living closest to the plant to safer areas. About 135,000 people had to leave their homes. Often they had no warning. Rescue workers suddenly appeared looking like spacemen wearing their protective clothes. The people had no idea what was going on, and the workers, they hurried the residents onto buses. Then they destroyed contaminated crops, food, and animals. But despite these efforts, thousands of people will eventually die from health problems caused by radiation. Many of these people are dying from cancer. So what did governments around the world do about this? Chernobyl was one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. After Chernobyl, people in the government promised that this would never happen again. Since Chernobyl, governments have done a few things to prevent these types of accidents from happening. First, they tried to improve safety standards at the nuclear power plants. Reactors have been changed to make them less likely to overheat. Other improvements make it easier to shut reactors down in emergencies. These efforts make it less likely that accidents at power plants will cause major radiation pollution. Second, nuclear power plants are now built far away from areas with lots of people. If an accident happens, they don't want large cities of people to be exposed to nuclear radiation. But unfortunately, they cannot build them too far away. These power plants still need to be close enough to provide electricity for people's homes and businesses. This also doesn't solve the problem of transboundary pollution. As we saw, even though the people in Belarus and in Lapland lived very far away, the radioactive particles, the dust, spread through the air and was a problem to them even though they were very far away. So that's what happened at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. As always, thank you for watching Mrs. Kate's YouTube channel, and thank you for doing your homework. If you have any questions, please write them down and bring them to class. Or you can post a comment on this YouTube page or on Schoology. Bye for now.